What's up again, everybody? We are back with more Lorcana gameplay as I roll sixes all day, every day. I'm back with Brendan over here, Brendan APG on Twitter. You should follow him on Twitter. And we're playing some more decks. This time you are on the old Ruby Amethyst, and I'm on Amber Steel. Would you look at that?
Yeah, so these are... They were, at least at the time of this recording, looked at as the two top decks in the meta, and these are very contemporary lists at that. Ruby Amethyst is an archetype, a set of colors that I'm very fond of. I really like this deck. And Amber Steel is just sort of, it's been doing really well in the meta. It's seen a lot of play on Pixelborn specifically. It was definitely the sort of most played deck at higher ELOs there for a while. It may have shifted now. We see more of a shift back towards Ruby Amethyst, I think, but... This is the Steel Amber list here is a sort of song list. You know, plays Ariels, plays Surfer Stitches, and has that general mid-range gameplay where it has a lot of board clear, but also a lot of board threats, conquest. It's just fundamentally a mid-range deck, to be honest.
Yeah, and so I had played a decent bit of Amber Steel prior to us getting together and playing these games, though the list that I had played was a lot more low to the ground. It was a lot more aggressive. It was really predicated upon building an early board, keeping that board, drawing a lot of cards off of like Rapunzel with some early value trades, and then just removing. It didn't have a lot of songs. I had not, up until this point, I had not played a Steel Song version of Amber Steel. And so for me, this was a very big learning experience and a really fun learning experience, but one that I definitely, and we were talking about this right before we hit record, one that I definitely figured out on the fly as we were going, and playing it into what you described as a favored matchup for Ruby Amethyst. You said many people didn't necessarily agree, but you think of this as favored.
I think that this matchup is extremely Ruby Amethyst favored, and I think that the reason that people think that it's closer is because they're piloting the Ruby Amethyst side maybe incorrectly. I think that there's some key heuristics you need to keep in mind as the Ruby Amethyst player. So you see Steven here play out a turn one, and then you see me ink my turn one Sergeant Tibbs, right? I don't commit the board. I let Steven have control of the board. Playing Sergeant Tibbs there would be a mistake. So, and here on turn two, I'm going to ink my Gaston, my turn two. So the reason I'm doing that is my deck has 21 or 22 uninkables. I simply mulligan 4 inkables, and then it's just critical that I get my ink drops every single turn, because I need to get up to 7 ink or 6 ink and then up to that 9 ink range. And my cards are just better than Steven's. And a critical way that Ruby Amethyst beats Steel Amber is just a 9 value to Rapunzel. So the key mistake I see a lot of Ruby Amethyst players make is to play something like Maleficent Sorcerer on turn 3. They'll draw a card with it, and on turn 4, they'll sing Friends on the other side with it. This is a very standard play line from Ruby Amethyst, but the reason why it's a mistake into Steel Amber is if they have any board presence, what they will do is they will take their Ariel or whatever other creature they have that has more than 2 defense. They will attack your Maleficent, and on turn 4, you know what they're going to do? Draw 2 cards of Rapunzel.
Yep, they're going to draw the cards.
Denying Rapunzel value is the number one way you win this matchup as Ruby Amethyst. Same thing goes for Surfer Stitch. You simply need to control the board as we get close to turn 7. You can do that with things like Be Prepared, and if you're on the play, you will hit turn 7 before them. You fit all your inkables, which is critical. But main thing is, you never let them get a favorable trade to be able to Rapunzel and draw cards in this matchup, and then you have way more card advantage than them. You draw more cards, and your cards will be higher quality than them in the late game. So for me, that's the key heuristic on beating this matchup. There is times when you can sort of break that mold, right? Let them draw Rapunzel, only if you're so far ahead that they could draw their entire deck. It won't matter because they simply can't beat you, and that's when you can let them draw Rapunzel. So this is a weird turn 3 from me. You see me cast Friends on the other side. So I'm looking at this from the Ruby Amethyst side and saying, how do I win this game? And I win this game by simply having more cards in my hand than you. I don't really care what you do on board on turns 1 through 5. It doesn't really matter because I'm probably going to be prepared you anyway. So I just want to get as many cards ahead of you as possible.
Right. And I want to go back to a couple of these turns and the choices that I've made here. So not having played a Steel Song list before, I am valuing things differently than perhaps I should. So I've inked a couple of things that you may not expect me to ink if you're going through. And I think looking back at the way I played out these first few turns of the game, I would most certainly have played them out differently, having looked at the way that the deck really kind of curves out and where the advantages can sort of lie. Here I'm going to shift into this Tinkerbell, and the thought being that yes, it allows me to establish a larger like board presence or like a body on the board, but it also lets me quest for 2. And my overall thought was that I just want to quest as quickly as I can into this deck that tries to control me. But as you've pointed out prior to us hitting record, it allows for this great 2-for-1 trade that you're able to do with Maui, and that is just strictly worse for me than maybe just playing out a different line. And keeping that Cerberus, for example, turn 1, a fantastic body to trade into or trade with and into some of your larger characters, probably would have been a better play. And here, as you saw, the 2-for-1 is fantastic for you and doesn't really make much hay for me by just really establishing an aerial, which is not a big threat for your deck.
Yeah, and I just want to point out how devastating it can be when you do things like shift tank into a Ruby Amethyst deck and potentially tap it. Is like it actually wasn't a 2-for-1; it was a 3-for-1 because of the shift mechanic there. My Maui actually traded with your big tank, your small tank, and your Captain Hook in the end. Maui also has Reckless, so you attacked Maui with Captain Hook. You could have quested with Captain Hook, and Maui would have had to attack it and traded either way because it had one more defense left. It's a 6/5.
Yeah.
So there's just some of the play lines that could have changed that sort of turn 5 sequence there. And we saw me as the Ruby Amethyst deck just get a lot of value on board out of that single card. And it sort of cements me ahead in this matchup. But I'm going back to my original game plan, which is I just want as many cards, to be as many cards ahead of you as possible. If you threaten the board in a meaningful enough way, I will change that game plan like what I did with the Maui. I will take valuable trades where I can. But I just need to draw cards.
Well, and I want to point this out too. So on that last turn, on my own turn, I chose to ink a Rapunzel, and it was at that moment where I kind of realized what your overall game plan into my deck was, and where you're just trying to have card advantage, have like removal options, trade advantageously, and that I'm not going to get value off of Rapunzel. And the Rapunzel that I was hoping to get value off of since turn 1 or turn 2 was just going to sit dead in my hand if I didn't. So using it as ink instead there was my choice. And if I would have realized that play line or that game plan that you would have, I would have played out those early turns in a much different respect, in a much different way. But again, this is why I think it's really good to know exactly what your deck wants to do and what your opponent is trying to do as well. And here playing the Whole New World to try and get rid of some of your threats. Unfortunately, I know that you're just going to draw into more of them. So I'm basically sort of Hail Marrying into hopefully removing several of those Be Prepareds and some other things. And I did actually grab 2 of them.
Yeah.
And so my hope is that I can maybe establish more of a board presence, make you try to trade down in a lot of just like this wide board that you can't really deal with without those Be Prepareds, and try to just quest out from that point.
That was an extremely high value whole new world. I got absolutely blown out by that whole new world because I skipped multiple turns by just casting Friends on the other side to try to get ahead of you in cards, and you simply negated all of that.
Right.
So that was a very good whole new world, and you saw me discard multiple premium cards at that. My thought pattern on not playing around a whole new world is that if you whole new world me on turn 5, turn 6, not turn 3 or something like that, if you dumped your hand extremely fast, once we get to that turn 7 and I have 7 ink, era of the game, my cards are just better than yours. My Ursula is just better. My Be Prepares are just better, and my Elsas they're just better cards that exist in your deck. Your deck is not really designed to compete with the Ruby Amethyst deck once we get past that sort of 7, 8, 9 lore point, especially when I have access to a draw engine and you don't.
That's exactly right. And honestly, that is encapsulated right here. So here in this moment on my turn, I'm looking at the board state and I'm going, okay, this Ursula is a 3/8 and is going to quest out every single turn or just trade down in such good ways. So, I mean, look, it can take aerial in one swing. If I don't just go super wide over the next 2 turns, then you just have so much more advantage in the race. And again, Lorcana's a race, and if you play towards the win condition of I'm just going to win the game with 20 lore, you can just start winning that very quickly on these higher ink totals. And so I feel very uncomfortable, even though I'm able to remove your magic mirror, play down a pretty solid like just body in a 4/4. It does not feel good from this perspective, even though I'm up on the lore and technically up, quote unquote, on the board.
You are faced with a pretty tough decision at this point, being the Steel Amber deck as we get into these later part of the turns. Like you said, you need to go wide, you need to start questing, you need to get ahead of me, right? You need to be the beatdown deck, but you open yourself up to be prepared at that point.
Yeah.
And you can try to play around be prepared, but at this point, you don't really have a choice because I'm going to start landing those premium cards. And I also discarded two off the back of the Whole New World, which is something to keep in mind. It's just much less likely I have one.
Right.
That being said, I mean, your cards don't really compete with mine on a one-for-one basis, right? My cards are simply just going to be more powerful, better in combat. They're going to quest for more, etc. But then I also have access to a board sweeper, so you can't compete on the one-for-one if you commit just a single card to board. We can't just play sort of that mid-range game plan, and you can't go wide. This is why I think that this can be a really rough matchup for Steel Amber, especially the mid-range Steel Amber. The aggro Steel Amber lists, I think, are better positioned to Ruby Amethyst, but these sort of Steel Song lists, it can be tough if you don't draw a lot of cards with something like Surfer Stitch, which is a very critical card for you, or with Rapunzel, which is sort of on the prerogative of the Ruby Amethyst player to deny value out of that.
Yeah, and honestly, it's actually one of my favorite sort of matchups to play in any card game is playing into a control deck that has these sort of board wipes wherein you're trying to establish enough value on the board that you maintain advantage, but not so much that it gives your opponent a reason to really want to play that board wipe. I mean, you can play games like that in Hearthstone. They're just so much fun. You can play games like that, and well, just really in any card game. And those are some of my favorite experiences. So even though I really enjoy that, in this moment, it does not feel very good knowing that you have 3 lore questers on the board that trade so well into everything that I have on the board myself. You're controlling the sort of the tempo of this from this point forward. I may have 3 characters on the board, but all of them can just sort of get gobbled up by everything you've got. And it's only just going to continue, assuming that you have more of these value cards in your hand. And so trying to dig through my deck to find answers, I would be looking for like my own type of board clears, like cards that can establish, like for example, Cinderella, that allow me to maybe sing out and play like grab your swords, and then maybe somehow trade advantageously off of the back of a grab your swords. Things that just allow me to pick off some of these big threats and hopefully still stay on the board. But at this point, I just can't play around another Be Prepared, and I have to just go as wide as possible.
So I broke my own heuristic here, and I want to talk about why. So I tapped down 2 of your characters with Elsa, your 2 big characters, your tank and your beast, and then I quested with Ursula when you still had a 2/3 body on the board, which would give you the chance to attack with Ariel into this Ursula, and then heal with Rapunzel and potentially draw 2 cards. So the reason why I did that is after questing for 3 and having 6 lore threatening on each quest here, I've decided that I am the beatdown now. You are no longer the aggressive deck. I'm the aggressive deck. You can draw a million cards. It kind of won't matter because I'm going to threaten 6 lore on the following turn. I have a Maleficent in hand, so I can single target removal whatever your best card is and out tempo you that way. So the reason why I broke the heuristic with that Ursula quest, because I usually don't quest with Ursula until those sort of points in the game, was because I figured at that point in time in the game, there was an inflection point where I have shifted from the control side of the matchup and am now the aggressive side.
Yeah, I think that's the exact right call too. And again, it's one of those really fun things about board state games like this. Something like a Keyforge, something like a Lorcana, where you have to measure your state. You measure the state of the game, at every single turn, and eventually you find a turn like this where, and I think you sussed it out exactly correctly, where you have the advantage, and it may be subtle. But in a race scenario, you have the advantage, and I have to sort of answer that call that you're about to be posing. Even though you were consistently or, just overall be considered the control deck, you can pivot, just like we saw in that previous game. If you want to go back and watch the previous game where we played some decks, I'll link in the description for that. But knowing when to pivot and how to play your deck and how to change is a huge, huge get, and can really, just give you the edge in a lot of different matchups.
Yeah, a lot of the cards, and just the way Lorcana is designed as a game, the cards are multifunctional, right? They have abilities that can be controlling in nature, like Ursula coming down, making you lose a lore, drawing a card. But they also have a dual function as cards that progress you towards your win condition. There aren't too many cards that don't sort of follow those principles. So most decks, whether they fall into the archetype of aggro, of mid-range, of control, I mean, aggro is kind of the outlier here, there are points in the game where your role on the board can change, right? From the control deck to the aggro deck, etc. There are some exceptions where, so there are a lot of aggro decks out there that will just quest completely agnostic of any information on the board. They simply just play characters and quest. They don't care, right? That's their win condition. But for all the other decks, while Elsa is one of the most controlling cards in the game, Ursula is one of the most controlling cards in the game. Like, those are also very aggressive cards. They quest for 3. That's a lot of lore I'm threatening.
Yeah, you play down the Maui and start cleaning up the board. I chose not to send multiple cards into, or send at least just one card into Elsa, because I figured, at that point, I've got 5 cards on the board. I've got 5 characters on the board, and I'm hoping that if I start questing and establish that Cerberus that I drew off of the BR guest, then I have a chance there of making an easy trade, and then following that up with, just continued questing, and start to make you play on the back end. With so many, just big 3 lore questers on the board, I want you to make the one, to be the one to make that trade, so that I can try and find these types of plays where I get a little bit of extra value on playing Tinkerbell, and then I can maybe follow it up with a grab your swords scenario. That is the goal and the aim for what my thought process was, but unfortunately you had the exact answer in a Dragonfire, and then you did end up making the trade with Elsa that I was hoping that you would, instead of having to do it myself. And that at least removed one threat, but you've just continued to have, this onslaught of just high value characters that have stuck the board.
Yeah, so we talked about me switching into the aggro role, but the reason why I traded with the Elsa was because it was fundamentally a 2-for-1. I'm landing more threats on the board, so I can sort of stabilize and clear board. Also, when I clear board, what happens is I deny you value off of Surfer Stitch, which is, at this point in the game, it is actually the only way I could possibly lose. Is maybe if you drew a bunch of cards of Surfer Stitch, Surfer Stitch, Surfer Stitch, you played it 4 times in a row, maybe. Maybe I would be in a bad scenario, but outside of that, it's just you're so far ahead as the Ruby Amethyst player here, you have to ask yourself the question of, how do I lose this game? There's not a lot of ways, but if there is one way and you can play around it, no reason not to. Because again, if you have 3 cards and I have 3 cards, and we're at the state of the game where we're both on 10 lore, my deck has access to more powerful cards at that top end curve.
And this is what you see right here. So finally able to play out a multiple card sort of combo of a clear to try and remove some of these big threats, where I start with grab your swords to clear the board after, getting you to these critical breakpoints of 2, and then follow that up with a smash on the Maleficent that you just played. Still, unfortunately, leaves that very powerful Ursula on the board, which continues to quest for 3, and going to draw up with the Beast Mirror on that play there, and unfortunately not find anything that we're going to want to establish, or we've paid everything. And you have full tempo and control with the board being clear on my side, a 3 lore quester on your side, and a 2-turn lethal that I'm just going to have to find some sort of answer to. Otherwise, I am just out of this game. And unfortunately, you followed up with another Ursula, another card draw, a lore loss, and every bit of tempo left in this game.
Yeah, it's a pretty tough scenario for you. So I did mention at the top of this game that I think it's a bad matchup for Amber Steel. I want to note that Steven is on a very, very traditional build of Amber Steel, a build that you would make to beat every deck in the format. Not to, if you want to build, what I'm trying to get to is, if you want to build your Amber Steel deck to target Ruby Amethyst, there are cards that can help you do that. So you can increase your equity in the matchup. You can play things like Hades, so you can have an infinite loop with the Hades in the graveyard. Basically always have some sort of board presence. You can play things like the top end 6 cost, I think it's Kronk or something, which can actually kind of trade and compete on board, but obviously dies to Dragonfire. I mean, there are cards that you can have access to which can help you in your matchup, but unfortunately your deck doesn't have that. And because of that, I mean, there's a reason for that, is that this version of Amber Steel is, in my opinion, the best mid-range deck. So it's better than all the other mid-range decks, and it beats those. But it absolutely destroys aggressive decks, and that's a reason why you would bring that kind of deck to a tournament, even if you had a sort of bad Ruby Amethyst matchup. Because what you want to avoid, and this happens a lot in card games, you don't want to attack your Steel Amber deck too much to beat Ruby Amethyst, that you start losing matchups against that aggro, or losing matchups in the mirror, etc.
Well, I think you also executed the matchup very well. You had your game plan put together, and it's one that was very effective, as you saw played out here, denying early card draw off of Rapunzel by not playing to the board, and then just establishing very powerful cards in the mid game to the late game, just made it really tough for me to put things together. And I think what we're talking about here is just me not realizing how really cool you can actually use these songs really as more of just like a guaranteed like ink drop every turn by pulling them out of the deck. I think you talked me through that, and having never played a Steel Song deck up to this point, I think if I would have thought that through or kind of understood that at the beginning, I definitely would have made some different decisions. But I think no matter what, I think you executed that to the T, and really shows why that deck is one of the best decks in the format, if not the best deck in the format.
Yeah, I think that Lorcana is a great game because the answer to that question of what is the best deck in the format is so controversial. It is so dynamic. It is so ever changing. That is just sort of an example of great game design and great balance.
Well, if you enjoyed this game and you want to see more, let us know in a comment below. Tell us what decks you want to see, what colors you want to see us played. We'll get together again and we'll play some more games for you. But as always, everybody, thanks for watching.